So gracious God, now as we gather, help us to learn and to grow as we explore the church universal, its beginnings, where we are now, and what the future might look like. Help us to learn something that will enlighten us and change us and help us to be more faithful and better stewards and better disciples going forward. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, everyone, so if you want to get comfortable, I don't have any a cheat sheet for you today, but I will get you some notes. So what we're going to talk about is the institutional church, okay? What do you think I mean when I say the institutional church, as opposed to what?
The business
Hierarchy.
of church.
I'm sorry, Susan?
The business of church.
The business of church.
Hierarchy.
Hierarchy. What else? Yeah, like when you say hierarchy, Terry, you mean like organization. Organization, the business, the buildings. Not just our spiritual, the idea that we're part of God's family, but the bricks, the mortar, the organizations, and all that, right? Marianne.
The doctrine.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you. The doctrines, the pile of things that we believe as a denomination or as a universal church, because they're different among different groups. But absolutely, institutions need, if they're good ones, they need a constitution, right? Sort of the rules that we're going to live by. And part of our constitution is the doctrines that we've said we are going to hold forth and trust and believe. So buildings, doctrines, organizations, and it goes even beyond that, Terry. It's even things like educational institutions that are a part of the church, mission organizations. So you get what I mean when I talk about the institutional church. All right, very good. So just a couple of questions we want to explore. So, do you think, has the church always looked like the church that, say, we have known in our lifetimes? Has the church always looked like that, like this?
No. Once we started ordaining women in the beginning, the women were not ordained.
Okay, Marianne brings up a great point. For one thing, in the last, I want to say 60 years, Marianne?
Something like that.
Things have changed in that women are now in leadership. Trust me on this, a long time ago, women were not in any kind of leadership,
That's right.
except in very, very rare circumstances. Okay, very good. Other things that make it different today than what it was in the beginning. Anybody have something? Well, that's what I want to talk about today. How do we get from that into or up to this more present time? And by present, I mean at least up to the Reformation and into what we know as church, okay? I want to talk about that. We're also going to talk about this. It feels like the church is sort of in decline in terms of sheer numbers of people that are around who are part of church organizations, who go to church fairly regularly. And also, what's the other thing that it feels like the church is in decline of? I don't know if that's a very good sentence. Jeff?
Age.
Ages, right. Ages are a little bit different. Although that's not completely different than the way it's been for about the last 30 or 40 years. Yes.
Membership.
Yes, membership is different. How about this one? Influence. Do you think the churches, and clergy for that most part, have the same level of influence, let's just say in American culture? I can tell you, I've been ordained 33 years or so. I can tell you in 33 years, I have experienced that. Clergy people do not enjoy the respect and the influence that they did even when I was ordained in 1990. It's happened that fast. Jane.
Well, it's the fact that even school systems,
Yeah.
and when we were growing up, they never had activities on Sunday and all that stuff.
Right. Yes.
And
Yes.
everyone who's participating in any kind of sport or anything, if there's no respect
Now that's happened in my lifetime, not at the beginning. At the very
That's-
beginning, it was just starting, and it rapidly picked up pace.
That's happened in
And
10 years.
Yeah, and we clergy screamed bloody murder,
Yes.
and it did no good. You know why? Because the church's influence in culture and in communities is not what it was back then. Used to, Sunday morning was sacred in the sense that really the only thing happening on Sunday morning was church. And I remember growing up, when I was a little boy, there were no stores open until noon. They did open at noon. Although many of you can remember when there were no stores open at all on Sunday. When I was a little boy, stores didn't open until noon, and a lot of restaurants were closed.
When I grew up,
Yeah.
stores were not open at all on Sunday.
Right, yeah. But then it went down to, okay, we'll open at 12, out of respect to church people, whatever. That's completely different now. I live close to Giant Eagle, and I swear most people shop on Sundays. Now, when I grew up, grocery stores weren't open on Sunday. You know, so that I don't want to belabor that, but those are just some examples of how the Christian faith, the institutional church, is not as influential, at least in North American culture, that it was even 20 or 30 years ago. And you don't have to be the brightest bulb in the hole to know that that is reality, right? So we're going to talk about that. And also the question, has this happened before? Is this a new thing? Anybody want to make a guess? Oh, it's happened over and over and over. Yeah. That gives me some comfort. I don't know about you, Steve. It gives me comfort, like, okay, we're in a glitch. Okay, we'll talk about that. And then finally, next Sunday, we're going to talk about, so Jim, what do you, get out your crystal ball, as it were. What do you think things will look like, let's say, 10 years from now, 50 years from now, how about 500 years from now? And I use that figure 500 for a reason that we'll talk about in a minute or two, okay? What do you think it's going to look like? I have some ideas. Somebody, I'm not sure who it was, left this on my desk or in my mailbox. There was an article in the Plain Dealer on September 6th, so last Wednesday, I guess it was, where the question is, front page, yeah. The question is, or it says, don't count God out just yet in American culture. Because a lot of people are saying, it's over, it's dead. No, it's not. It's not. And all we need to do is look across the Atlantic Ocean at Europe, different parts of Europe, because they went through this 50 years ago. It just caught up with us. I knew it was going to happen. We all knew it was going to happen. But you know what sped it up by 20 years? COVID. COVID sped up this process. I'm guessing by at least 20 years. We'll talk about that. All right? Okay, so we're clear on that. Yes?
I think the other interesting thing is that with the chosen, which is the life of Jesus, it's on its 4th episode, and it's wildly popular.
Yeah. Linda's, how many of you watching that series called The Chosen?
It's kind of shows it.
I can tell you people, spirituality, the search for God is not dead. It's not. In fact, I personally think it's more alive than ever. Maybe not ever, but certainly in my lifetime. A genuine searching. The challenge is a lot of the people who are doing the searching are finding other places to search, or venues outside the institutional church. They are, but they're out there. I think younger people, there are a few really hostile atheists out there, but many of them are actually genuinely, earnestly searching. They're more open to the mystical side of life than most of us. And they think that we sit here and it's all just up in our heads, which for some of us, that is where faith is. It's an intellectual thing. For young people, it's like, no, I want an experience. I want a religious, spiritual experience, which I find really, really cool and really interesting. All right, so question 1. And by the way, when I get about 5 minutes to noon, somebody start waving their hands, because I promised you noon, we're going to do noon. We'll get through this stuff. Okay, question 1, has the church always looked like the church that we have now? Has it always been like this? Well, the short answer is no. No, absolutely not. One of the things that a new love that I have discovered in, say, the last 6 months to a year is what is known in seminaries as Christian origins. Christian origins. So if this isn't what the church looked like, what did it look like? What was it really like those first, let's say, 300 years, 200 or 300 years? Now, I know what I learned in seminary, or what I think I learned in seminary. The exciting thing is that in the last 20 years, there's been new research, new discoveries, new things have been found. Because what we're learning is what's in the New Testament is not completely thorough. Most of it is the views of Paul. And what was apparently suppressed was the views of Jesus' brothers who took the church over after his death, or who sort of became in charge. And that is James the Just and Jesus' other half-brother Simeon. How many of you knew that? I didn't know that. It's coming to light now. There was great division in the earliest church, and I want to talk about that. So most of us, if you know your Bibles, know that as Jesus was ending his ministry, that he was giving direction and guidance to the disciples that his movement, his new movement, his messianic movement was going to continue, but it was going to be up to them to be in charge, right? We sort of know that. What we don't really know a lot about is really how did it happen? What did it look like? When did it morph into what it is, right? And a lot of people believe that who took the church over? Who do we think? Who has it been said for thousands of years led the church? Peter. It's not true. It's absolutely not true. It's not true. James the Just. Peter, James and John, not James the Lord's brother, but the other James. Jesus gave them the keys of the kingdom. Remember that? We talked about that a few Sundays ago. He said to Peter, to you I'll give the keys of the kingdom. And in my mind, until about a year ago, I'm like, well, I guess that means you get the keys, you're the head dude, you run the place, right? That's not what it meant. Keys of the kingdom was a way of talking about making decisions, like a court of the church. And Peter, James, and John, his closest disciples, became this first group that led the church after his crucifixion. Peter was one of them, but he was not the person. And guess what happened? After Jesus' death, according to Paul, Jesus appeared to his brother James, who at that point was not a follower. His family were not his followers. His followers were outside of his family. After his death, they had, like Paul did, some bizarre mystical experience. And apparently he appeared, it says that Paul said he appeared to his brother James. James the Just then became a believer. Now he was a very, very devout Jewish person. He was a member of the Davidic dynasty. He and Jesus were direct descendants of David. And guess what? We know from other early church fathers and theologians that Peter, James, and John chose who to continue Jesus' ministry? His brother. And he did it. Anybody have an idea how long he lasted? If Jesus died roughly in 30 AD, and then shortly thereafter James the Just became the leader of the church in Jerusalem, he lived until 62 AD, so about 30 or so years. And what happened to James the Just? It was a horrible death. Did anybody know?
He was martyred.
He was martyred, and it was brutal. And guess who martyred him? The son of, his name was Caiaphas, but he was the son of the Caiaphas who murdered Jesus, who had Jesus killed, the high priest. And the way it happened was this. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but apparently the Roman emperor, it would have been Claudius, I think, right? Claudius, Roman emperor, was replacing the local king over Israel. You know, you'll go and you'll be my local guy. And in that interregnum, in between the guy's death and the new guy showing up, Caiaphas, the high priest, he ordered the death of James the Just. And what the story goes, that they took him to the top of the southeastern wall of the temple, which was the highest place above. And as is done in Middle Eastern culture, they threw him over the wall. He survived, and then they went down and finished him off with stones. And there's multiple stories that's how they killed him. Here's the thing, though, that even the non-believing Jews in Jerusalem were so appalled at what Caiaphas did that when the new king came and arrived, they complained to him, and that's one of the powers that the king had, even though he was a secular king, was to remove the high priest. And so they complained and said, they killed James the Just because James the Just was so highly respected among believers and Jews that they were ticked. And the new king had Caiaphas thrown out, and they put a new high priest in his place. And that's how James the Just died. But after he died, guess who his successor was? His name is Simon, who was a half-brother of Jesus. And we know this through the church fathers. It doesn't say that in the scriptures. It does talk about James the Just. Anybody know the stories in the book of Acts? That James the Just settled a very important question in the life of the church.
The Gentiles did not have
To be circumcised. Yeah. There was this, the church was mostly Jewish, 90% Jewish. But then these Gentiles were coming in, and the Jewish followers of Jews said, well, you know, if they're going to be good Jews of this Messiah Jesus, don't they have to be circumcised and follow the rules just like we do? And they took the question in front of Peter, James, and John, and James the Just. He says, they went up to Jerusalem, and they battled it out. And that was the first council, of the worldwide council of the church. And James the Just settled the question. Do you know what he said?
They didn't have to be circumcised.
He said, I wrote it down here. He said, having heard this, this is what I've decided. One guy said, okay, number one, that Gentile believers don't have to be circumcised. And they don't have to follow all of our rules about diet and stuff, but they do have to do this. They're not supposed to eat blood. You can't eat meat that was sacrificed in front of an idol in a pagan. Because a lot of people, they would offer the animal and then they would eat it. The Jews did the same thing. But they said, don't eat meat that was offered to a pagan idol. Don't eat anything with blood. And they said, don't have sex out of wedlock. And James the Just made that decision. And Paul said it, that he did. And then later on, James was hearing stuff about Paul. By the way, one of the new scholars on the Apostle Paul, and especially James the Just, is James Tabor. He was a professor at University of North Carolina, since retired. Man, you want to watch fascinating YouTube videos. Go home and look at James Tabor videos. But he said that the church was centered in Jerusalem. And it wasn't a church. They went to synagogue on Saturday. And then on the side, they met together on Sunday, which they called the Lord's Day. Why? Because Jesus was raised from the dead on the third day. They went to church they met together. They didn't go to church. They met together to eat and to pray together, sing hymns. But their worship experience remained in the synagogues and in the temple. He said the church, the early believers, I have to stop saying church, the early believers were very, very Jewish. It was just a little sect inside Judaism, led by Jesus' brothers, all of whom were descended from David. And he calls it the Jesus dynasty. That's why there was a succession, and it had to pass to the bloodline. Fascinating stuff. I encourage you to read it. But anyway, that's what the earliest church looked like. Jane.
I've often, recently, I've been thinking about the fact that, at Christmas time, we know about Mary and Joseph, and then, they've just disappeared.
Yeah.
I mean, until the day of the crucifixion, when someone anointed one of the disciples to be the son, look after his mother. But, and now we're hearing about all these other people in the family who were so important to the people of the church.
I didn't know either, Jane. Because the Bible doesn't say it. It's silent on a lot of that stuff. We just don't know. We do know there's a couple examples where his brothers and his mother, and he had a couple of sisters too. They would show up and they were like, Jesus, you need to stop. You're causing trouble. They were not supportive. They wanted it to stop. Because if they come after you, they're going to come after us. Because we're part of this whole David dynasty too. And he was like, no. Who are my brother, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, all of you? He was like, no, I'm not going to. It took a while for them to come around and truly believe that he was the long-awaited Messiah, Christ, anointed figure. But we don't get all that in the Bible. We learn about it later. And there are people who say that Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, how much of Acts is devoted to Peter and how much is devoted to Paul? At chapter 9, Peter disappears. The book of Acts is largely about Paul. It's not about Peter or the early church. It's all about Paul and all of his really cool, fun, wild journeys. Read it. And then until they would get dragged back into Jerusalem because they said, we're hearing, what are you teaching as you go about the Mediterranean? Because they're all law-abiding Jews. They're continuing to keep the law, to keep the Sabbath, but they believe that their brother Jesus was the Messiah. But they're going to the synagogue. And they go, what are you teaching these Gentiles out there? Come and tell us. And Paul came, and you can read about it, it's chapter 18, and he tries to explain himself that most of his ministry is to Gentiles, not to Jews. And he says, you guys have already said, Gentiles don't have to become Jews. What they were God-fearers. They were what's called God-fearers, which were non-blood Jews who worshipped in the synagogue and believed in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But they weren't required to keep the same stringent rules and laws that the Jews were. And so a lot of Paul's tortured theology in the book of Romans is him trying to make this sense out of it. How does this work? And then he talks about the adoption theory, that Jesus came, and as we trust in him, where the Gentiles become adopted into this family of faith. You're not blood, you're like adopted children. And he goes on and on and on, and sometimes I don't understand what he is talking about. That is Paul the Pharisee, trying to reconcile all of his very traditional Jewish Pharisaic beliefs with the fact that he had a bizarre mystical experience on the road that completely flipped his life inside out. That he had a real experience with this Jesus that he didn't even know. Did you all know that Paul didn't even know Jesus? Paul wasn't a follower of Jesus, never heard him preach or teach. This all happened because of something that he experienced on the road to Damascus. And they're like, we're not sure you're following the rules here. We want to know, what are you teaching these people? And Tabor says that he thinks Paul may have not fibbed, but told the truth that they needed to hear at the time. Because what happened was Paul started organizing what started to seem like non-Jewish congregations, because they weren't Jewish. Most of them were Gentiles. And they were meeting together. And that's really the beginning of the church, the institutional church, apart from the synagogue. Now, so what happened in Jerusalem? Well, what happened there was, number one, James the Just was murdered at 62. Simon or Simeon became the next leader of the church. They call them overseers, or the word that we now say presbyter or bishop. But then they fled, because at that point, the whole Jewish revolt against Rome, remember Jesus kept predicting it was going to happen. He kept saying, you guys keep this up, the whole thing's going to come down around your ears. Well, that all finally happened in 70. Rome got tired of it. There was a Jewish revolt. They came in, they surrounded the city, they starved the people to death. There were reports that they actually became cannibals. They started to eat each other. I don't know if that's true or not. And anyone who fled the city, they would grab them, and guess what? They got crucified. They crucified thousands of Jews who tried to flee. But the Christians got out early, most of them. They fled. Remember, Jesus said, when you see this coming, flee. Flee to the mountains. And they did. You know where they went? Anybody? They went to this town called Pella. They fled. Most of the Christians in Jerusalem fled the city. They knew what was happening. If you stay, you're going to die. Even though we're different, we're different. The Romans don't know. The Romans don't understand all this nuance. You better get out. And they did. And they settled in this town called Pella. And there they survived until Simeon died. And then what happened was Rome fell. They came and they destroyed the temple as much as they could. They just destroyed as much as they could. They burned down the wooden structures in Jerusalem, killed thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people. It was a horrible 70 AD, the destruction of Jerusalem. So at this point, there's really no Jewish believers in Rome or in Jerusalem. So the city that once was the headquarters of this Jesus movement is no more. It's now headquartered in Pella.
And what country is Pella in?
I believe it would now be in Syria. I'm not sure. I'll find out. I believe it would, back then it would now be inside the country of Syria. So if you go up into the Golan Heights above the Sea of Galilee, so it would have been outside of the reign of they're not going to come looking for us up there. They're more about destroying the headquarters of this problematic people. But what then happened, though, was that the church, it started to spread. Paul had founded these churches. And by the way, Paul was not the only missionary that founded churches. I've got a list of them together. And this is something that I never really consciously thought of. But even in the book of Acts, Barnabas was a missionary. Apollos, you've heard that name. He was a missionary that started churches. Peter was another missionary. Peter started some churches. John's kind of sketchy. There's a lot of Johns in the Bible. And then Thomas. Where do we think Thomas? Remember doubting Thomas? Where did the church fathers say he went? He fled India. That he took the message of Jesus to India. Thomas is revered in India. And the Christians there had their start through who? Doubting Thomas. So this thing started to spread. And guess what? At some point, the lines crossed, and the church, the movement, the Jesus movement became more Gentile than Jewish. And the other thing was the Jews basically kicked the believers out of the synagogue. They finally said, we've had enough of this stuff. You're heretics. You're nothing but a bunch of problem makers. Get out. And so they were disfellowshipped from the synagogues. And that was the beginning. And all of that would have been probably 70s, 80s, 90s. That's how the church started to be different. That's how in Christianity became a religion, not just a sect within Judaism. It started to morph into another new religion of God-fearers based on Judaism and the scriptures of the Jews. Does that make sense? Is that news to you? Does that sound like, okay, I kind of knew that, or maybe?
Sounds new.
Yeah, but that's really what happened. That's really what happened. So when I was in seminary, and this is probably true of Cinda and Steve too, we read, this was our history of Christian origins. There was this 2-volume, Justo Gonzalez. Since that time, this was published in the late 70s, I think. Since that time, many more new discoveries have happened, new manuscripts, new understandings of church fathers, of ancient church religious historians who tell the true story, not just the ones that's mostly came out of Paul's mouth. So the fact is that the early believers were Jewish. They kept the Sabbath day. They followed the kosher rules. They continued to keep kosher tables. They continued to circumcise their male babies. They continued to go to synagogue. It wasn't a church. Yes, they met apart from that on Sundays, to eat together, to pray together. It was a fellowship thing, because they didn't do that in synagogues. And that was one way they held themselves together. And slowly but surely over time, as more and more Gentiles, God-fearers, came into the movement, it started to separate from the synagogue and looked less and less and less Jewish, to the point where there was a lot of hostility aimed at the Jewish people from these new believers as the church became more and more Gentile. Somebody have their hand up? Oh, yes.
So with the fellowship time, the Sunday, was that more men and women together?
Yeah. But even then, Paul says, well, they were still arguing about, should the women sit with the men?
Yeah.
And, all those, they were still, and this stuff came before Paul. I just reread the book of Galatians last week. The book of Galatians is all about a largely Gentile church in Galatia, which there were several, it was sort of like in eastern Turkey. Paul apparently founded these churches, mostly Gentile. And some Jewish people, believers, came in and said, you guys are not following the rules at all. If they knew about this down at headquarters, this would be bad. And so they started saying, you need to circumcise your males. Well, it got back to Paul. And remember chapter 3, where Paul gets so mad, he writes this letter, he goes, you foolish Galatians, you're turning away from what I taught you. And you're going back to the law and depending on the law for your salvation. That would not have sounded very good in kosher-keeping Jewish ears. But that's what the book of Galatians is all about. A largely Gentile group being unduly influenced by and they were Pharisees who came in and said, you guys, you've gone off the deep end. You need to reel it back in. You need to start to look more Jewish. But that's an example of that slow separation of the Gentile believers from the Jews. And can you imagine being a Jewish believer in Jesus? Where do you go? Do I stay? Do I leave this tradition, this faith? Or to go off on this new thing? And some did. I'm sure that that first generation, they just continued to go to synagogue and all that. And then slowly they died out. But clearly, it became mostly Gentile after a while, due to the efforts of Paul and other missionaries. Yes?
How would you define Gentiles?
Gentiles were non-biological Jews. They were not part, they could not identify that they were a part of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Yeah. They were not, it was a biology issue, Catherine. I'm not a part of this family. It was a very cultural, ethnocentric group, and you knew. And so the Gentiles were those outside of it, whether they were Greeks or they were the ancient Palestinians who had lived in the land before these Hebrews arrived, with all their talk about circumcision and whatever.
How did Paul find and attract them?
That is a very good question. I personally think, and I don't agree with a lot of Paul's theology, and you guys know that, but I truly do believe that Paul had a very, very life-changing, powerful mystical experience. And he was so utterly convinced that he had been contacted from the other world by the Spirit of Jesus. He gave up a really nice life. And that's why I'm convinced it was real. Why would he have done that if it wasn't real? But that's how Paul changed. And he believes that God did that in order to take the faith of the ancient Hebrews and do what they didn't do, to proclaim it to the whole world. They didn't. They kept it for themselves. And then Jesus did it, and Paul said, now I am Jesus' emissary. I'm going to take this message to the Gentiles. And he called himself, I am an apostle to the Gentiles. Does that make sense? All right. Isn't this stuff fascinating? Okay, so we'll see you next Sunday, and we'll talk about what then happened and where might we be going. Thanks for coming, everybody.